Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're immersing ourselves in the foundational science of diagnostic imaging.
We really are.
We've been handed what is basically the ultimate study guide, RA110. And this means we're not just talking about pictures.
No, not at all.
We were talking about the essential physics, the cutting-edge technology, and I think most critically, the ironclad safety protocols that govern the use of X-rays.
It's dense stuff.
Oh, it's dense. It's highly specialized, but it's absolutely fascinating.
It is. I mean, it's the science of making the invisible visible and doing it safely and with incredible speed.
Right.
So our mission for this deep dive is to kind of shortcut the learning curve for you. We're going to aggressively distill the core concepts,
Okay.
how X-rays are generated, how those photons interact with human anatomy to create an image, the different digital methods used for capture, and, the non-negotiable mathematical rules.
Things like the inverse square law.
Exactly. The inverse square law, the 15% rule. Things that allow professionals to control exposure and protect the patient and themselves.
This is truly applied physics in a clinical setting, so we're going to treat it with the seriousness it deserves. We're starting at, the absolute starting point.
You have to.
Defining the invisible force we're studying. Because if you don't grasp the fundamental nature of the radiation, you can't possibly harness its power safely or effectively. Okay, let's start with the fundamental definition that separates X-ray imaging from, say, ultrasound or an MRI. What is ionizing radiation, and why does that concept define both the danger and the utility of this entire field?
It's a great question. Ionizing radiation is defined by its energy level. It's electromagnetic radiation, like X-rays and gamma rays, that possess sufficient energy to cause ionization.
And what does ionization actually mean in this context?
It means the incoming photon has enough power to physically knock an electron out of orbit from an atom it encounters.
So it's physically changing the atom.
It is. Once an atom loses or gains an electron, it becomes an ion that changes its electrical charge and fundamentally its chemical properties.
So the danger isn't the heat or the light or anything like that.
Yeah.
It's the fact that it chemically alters the building blocks of biological life, our cells, our DNA.
Precisely. That ionization process is the key to both the image and the hazard. On one hand, the different ways matter ionizes creates the contrast we see on the image.
Ah, okay.
But on the other hand, that same ionization is what makes the radiation biologically active and potentially damaging. It starts this cascade of cellular damage that can lead to somatic or genetic effects. It just demands the deepest level of respect.
And the machine that creates this controlled burst of power is the X-ray tube. I mean, it's an incredibly sophisticated vacuum tube. And we need to understand the engine room, the parts essential for X-ray production.
Right.
What are the core components inside that evacuated glass envelope that actually generate the beam?
Okay, so you need a system that focuses and accelerates electrons, and then you need a target to stop them abruptly. The tube consists of the cathode, that's the negative electrode,
Right.
and it houses the filament, which is typically made of tungsten.
Why tungsten?
It has a really high melting point and a high atomic number. So when you heat this filament, it boils off electrons in a process we call thermionic emission.
And those electrons have to go somewhere, presumably very fast.
They do. They're accelerated by high voltage toward the anode, the positive electrode, which serves as the target. The anode is often made of a molybdenum base with a coating of tungsten-rhenium alloy on the focal track.
Tungsten again.
Tungsten again, for the same reasons. High atomic number improves X-ray production efficiency, and that high melting point is critical. The whole process hinges on converting kinetic energy. The accelerated electrons slam into the focal spot on the anode.
And then what happens?
Well, about 99% of that kinetic energy is converted into heat.
99%.
99%. Only about 1% is converted into X-rays via two main processes: Bremsstrahlung, or braking radiation, and characteristic radiation.
Wait, 99% heat. That intense heat generation must be the primary reason for equipment failure. Let's talk about what can damage or shorten the life of an X-ray tube.
It is the single biggest operational issue. The instantaneous influx of energy can reach tens of thousands of heat units. The most common failures are directly related to that thermal stress.
So if you don't let it cool down properly.
Exactly. If the technologist doesn't allow adequate cooling time between high exposure shots, or if they apply a very high exposure to a cold anode, you can get pitting, cracking, or eventually melting of the anode surface.
Which would ruin the image quality.
It dramatically degrades image quality by changing the focal spot size.
And what about the other side, the cathode?
On the cathode side, continuous or repeated high temperatures cause the tungsten filament to literally evaporate. We call it filament evaporation.
So it just wears away.
Over time, yeah. The tungsten atoms deposit inside the glass tube, forming a metallic layer. This can lead to electrical arcing.
A short circuit.
Basically, yeah. The high voltage jumps between the anode and the deposited tungsten, short-circuiting the tube and leading to catastrophic failure. So managing tube longevity really means meticulously managing the thermal load, calculating heat units, and respecting the tube's rating limits. Hashtag 1.2, the language of the settings, basic terms.
That intense power has to be strictly controlled, which brings us to the three critical levers we pull to command the X-ray beam. These are the fundamental dials that control the quantity and quality of the X-rays produced.
These three settings are the technologist's alphabet.
So let's introduce and really define these three basic terms.
Okay, first up we have kVp, or kilovoltage peak.
Yeah.
This is the voltage applied across the X-ray tube during the exposure.
Yeah.
It dictates the maximum energy of the photons produced. So it's the primary control for the quality or penetrating power of the beam.
So higher kVp means more punch.
A higher kVp means the resulting X-rays are harder. They penetrate denser tissue more effectively, and this profoundly affects the resulting image contrast.
I get the kVp is the quality control.
Yeah.
But how does it relate to the spectrum of X-rays? You said peak.
That's a crucial detail. When you set the kVp, you are setting the peak energy. The beam produced is heterogeneous. It contains a range of energies, but none are higher than that kVp setting.
I see.
So increasing the kVp not only raises that maximum energy, but it also increases the average energy of the entire beam, making it more efficient and more penetrating. This is why even small changes in kVp have such a massive impact on the final image and on the patient's dose.
Okay, so contrast that with the quantity control. MAs, or milliampere seconds.
Right. MAs is the measure of the total quantity or intensity of the radiation produced. It's a product of two things. The tube current, MA, which is the flow of electrons from cathode to anode per second, and the duration of the exposure in seconds.
So that's just how many photons you're making in total.
Essentially, yes. MS determines how many total photons are generated. If you double the MAs, you double the number of photons hitting the patient. It's the primary control for the overall density or brightness of the image.
And finally, we have this spatial relationship, SID, the source-to-image distance.
SID is just the physical distance between the focal spot on the anode and the image receptor, the detector plate.
Sounds simple.
It is a purely geometric factor, but its impact is governed by the inverse square law, meaning distance dramatically affects the intensity of the beam reaching the detector.
We'll definitely come back to that one.
Oh, we will. If you're off by even a small distance, the change in exposure can be huge, which means the technologist has to compensate with kVp or MAs.
Okay, so let's follow those photons once they leave the tube. The source material defines three critical states of radiation based on where it is. Let's trace the beam's journey and define primary, remnant, and exit radiation.
The primary radiation is the beam the instant it exits the X-ray tube port, before it has encountered the patient. It's tightly collimated and highly organized.
The clean beam.
The clean beam, once that beam enters the patient, it's attenuated, it's absorbed, scattered, or transmitted. The photons that successfully pass through the patient and continue traveling toward the detector plate are called the remnant radiation. They are carrying the diagnostic signal.
Okay, now, the distinction between remnant and exit radiation sometimes causes confusion. We should probably clear that up.
That's a fair point. Remnant radiation is the physical beam leaving the patient. Exit radiation is the signal after the remnant photons interact with the image receptor and the energy is converted into a readable electronic signal or digital data.
So one is the physical thing, the other is the data it creates.
That's a good way to put it. While some materials use the terms interchangeably to refer to the beam that hits the detector, it's more technically precise to say that the remnant beam creates the exit signal. The key takeaway is everything before the patient is primary, and everything that hits the detector plane is remnant exit, carrying the diagnostic information. Hashtag 1.3. How photons interact with matter.
So now we enter the physical process of image formation. When that primary beam hits the patient, its intensity is reduced. We call this process attenuation. Unpack what that word means in the context of human tissue.
Attenuation is the reduction in the intensity or the number of photons in the X-ray beam as it passes through matter. This isn't one simple process, though. It's a combination of two things happening at the same time. X-ray photons being completely absorbed.
Giving their energy to the tissue.
Right. and X-ray photons being scattered, which means they just change direction. The difference in attenuation between bone and muscle and air is what fundamentally creates the image contrast.
This differential attenuation leads to the visual language of the image itself, radiolucent and radiopaque.
Exactly. Think of it like a shadow. Radiolucent structures like air in the lungs or soft tissue are easily penetrated. They cause very little attenuation, so a high number of photons pass through and strike the detector.
And a high signal in the detector shows up as dark on the image.
It appears dark, yes. Conversely, radiopaque materials like dense bone, metal implants, or contrast media effectively block or absorb the beam. They cause high attenuation.
So very few photons get through.
Few or none. And where few or no photons strike the detector, those areas appear white or bright.
Okay, and this is where it gets really interesting, because the specific way a photon interacts with the body determines both the utility of the image and the dose delivered. The study guide mentions there are 5 primary interactions, but for what we care about, diagnostic imaging and safety, we focus on 2 critical ones.
Overwhelmingly, yes. The photoelectric effect and Compton scattering.
These are the yin and yang of radiography, aren't they?
Absolutely. We are constantly trying to maximize the information provided by one while minimizing the noise and dose contributed by the other.
So let's start with the one that's good for the image, the photoelectric effect.
Right. The photoelectric effect occurs when an incident X-ray photon transfers all of its energy to an inner shell electron of an atom within the patient.
All of it.
All of it. The electron gets ejected, and crucially, the X-ray photon is completely absorbed. It just vanishes. Because that photon is totally removed from the beam, this interaction creates the distinct contrast we need for the image. It results in those bright radiopaque areas where high-density tissue like bone absorbs most of the beam.
It gives us that high subject contrast.
Precisely.
You mentioned that maximizing image contrast often means maximizing patient risk. Why is the photoelectric effect the main contributor to patient dose?
Because the photon is completely absorbed, 100% of its energy is deposited right into the patient's body at that one localized point. That causes maximum ionization and maximum biological risk. And this effect is highly dependent on the atomic number of the tissue.
So bone, with its high atomic number.
Bone has a much higher atomic number than soft tissue, so it absorbs photons far more efficiently via the photoelectric effect. This leads to excellent contrast, but it concentrates the dose in those high Z materials.
Which brings us to the villain of our story. Compton scattering.
Compton. This is what happens when the incident photon interacts with a less tightly bound outer shell electron. The photon transfers only some of its energy to the electron, causing the electron to recoil.
Only some. So what happens to the photon?
The crucial part is that the X-ray photon is not destroyed, it's merely deflected. It changes direction, becoming a scattered photon. And this new photon carries no useful anatomical information whatsoever.
So these scattered photons are just chaos.
Yeah.
What is their real-world impact?
Their impact is twofold, and both are terrible. First, they reduce image quality. Since these scattered photons are traveling randomly, they strike the image receptor in locations unrelated to the true anatomy.
Creating a fog.
A generalized fog, yes. It lowers the image contrast, making the image look gray and flat. Second, and this is critical for safety, these scattered photons are the major contributor to occupational dose.
The dose to the staff in the room.
Yes. They spray out in all directions, primarily back toward the technologist and staff standing near the patient.
So our goal is to engineer a system that favors total absorption over deflection. Let's just reiterate the fundamental difference between these two.
Okay. A photoelectric is the high contrast interaction, total absorption. It maximizes differential attenuation, but it also maximizes patient dose.
And Compton.
Compton is the low contrast, high noise interaction, partial absorption, and deflection. It minimizes image quality, but it maximizes occupational dose. And one more thing.
Go on.
Photoelectric absorption is dominant at lower kVp settings and in high Z materials like bone, while Compton scattering becomes the dominant interaction at the higher kVp settings we typically use in clinical practice. And it's independent of the tissue's atomic number, meaning it occurs just as much in bone as it does in muscle.
If Compton is the chaos, how do we physically stop it from ruining the image and increasing staff dose?
That brings us to one of the most critical pieces of equipment, the grid. Since scattered radiation travels in multiple directions while the remnant diagnostic beam travels straight, the grid is placed between the patient and the image receptor. It's essentially a very finely crafted filter.
Made of lead.
Usually, yes. Strips of highly radiopaque material, like lead, separated by radiolucent interspace material. The grid is aligned to only allow photons traveling straight, the good remnant beam to pass through, while absorbing the angled, scattered Compton photons.
That sounds like an essential solution. But what's the trade-off for using a grid? There's always a trade-off.
There is. The trade-off is that even perfectly aligned grids absorb a small percentage of the useful non-scattered photons. More importantly, because the grid absorbs all that scatter, it significantly reduces the overall exposure reaching the detector.
So you have to turn up the power.
You do. Whenever a grid is used, the technologist must drastically increase the maze setting, sometimes by a factor of 2, 3, or even 4 to maintain the necessary exposure.
Which means more dose for the patient.
Exactly. The image quality improves dramatically, but the patient dose goes up significantly to compensate for the grid's filtration. It's a constant compromise between image quality and dose.
We've established the physics of X-ray generation and interaction. Now let's move on to Section 2, how we actually capture that remnant signal and turn it into a readable digital diagnostic image. Hashtag 2.1 imaging technology differences. The sources outline a major technological shift that changed radiography forever. Let's differentiate between CR, computed radiography, and DR, digital radiography.
Right. CR was the necessary bridge from analog film to digital data. The CR system uses a cassette containing a photostimulable phosphor PSP plate.
A PSP plate.
It's often made of barium fluoride. When X-rays hit this plate, they excite electrons in the phosphor, trapping them in high-energy locations.
So the image information is stored, but it's latent, like on old film.
Exactly. The cassette then has to be manually transported to a separate processor. Inside that processor, a focused helium-neon laser scans the PSP plate.
And the laser does what?
The energy of the laser frees those trapped electrons, causing them to emit light photostimulated luminescence in proportion to the initial X-ray exposure.
And a detector reads that light.
A photodetector captures that emitted light and converts it into a digital electrical signal. It's an efficient process, but it relies on physical plate handling and processing time.
And DR is the current dominant technology known for its speed.
DR is instantaneous. It uses a permanently installed flat panel detector that is hardwired to the computer. When the X-rays hit the detector, the image data is sent directly to the acquisition workstation almost immediately.
So no more running cassettes back and forth.
It completely eliminates the cassette handling step, massively improving workflow and reducing image acquisition time to just a few seconds.
Now within DR itself, we need to deep dive into the two distinct ways the X-ray energy is converted into a readable charge. Indirect capture DR and direct capture DR.
This is all about engineering the conversion steps. Indirect capture DR is a two-step process, and it's the most common and cost-effective method.
Two-step.
First, X-rays hit a scintillator material, usually cesium iodide or gadolinium oxysulfide. The scintillator converts the high-energy X-rays into visible light photons.
So it glows.
It glows. Second, that light is then absorbed by an array of amorphous silicon-thin film transistors, TFTs, which convert the light into a measurable electrical charge. So it's X-ray to light to charge.
Okay, X-ray to light to charge. And what does direct capture gain by bypassing that light step?
Direct capture DR uses a single conversion step, X-ray straight to charge.
Much more efficient.
It employs a layer of amorphous selenium. X-ray photons strike the selenium, which is an excellent photoconductor, and the energy is converted directly into an electrical charge. This charge is then collected by the underlying TFT array.
And the benefit?
Because there is no intermediate light step, there's less lateral light spread. This results in higher spatial resolution, meaning you can resolve finer details.
But there's a downside.
The trade-off is that amorphous selenium systems are often more expensive and slightly more prone to detector damage.
Okay, so beyond the hardware, we need to differentiate between the types of procedures themselves. Dynamic versus static X-ray procedures. Why does this distinction dramatically impact dose and image acquisition time?
Right. Static X-ray procedures are those single, high-resolution snapshots, a standard chest X-ray, and abdomen film. The exposure is extremely short, measured in milliseconds, and the focus is on maximizing detail.
A still photo.
A still photo. Dynamic X-ray procedures, primarily fluoroscopy, are real-time moving images. They're like a video.
So for guiding surgeries and things like that?
Exactly. Procedures like angiography or guiding orthopedic surgery. Because you are constantly streaming X-rays to generate, say, 30 frames per second of live video, the cumulative acquisition time can be minutes long.
And minutes of streaming X-rays equals a huge dose implication.
A massive one. Even though the individual dose rate per second is relatively low compared to a high-powered static shot, the accumulated dose in dynamic fluoroscopy is exponentially higher for both the patient and the staff.
Especially for the staff in the room.
Yes, especially considering the inverse square law is often working against the staff in an operating room environment. This is why strict time management and limiting fluoroscopic beam on time are absolutely critical safety parameters. Hashtag 2.2 image quality and enhancement.
Now that we're in the digital domain, we face specific image quality problems that are directly linked to the physics of the initial exposure. We need to define and discuss quantum model and saturation. These represent the two extremes we're trying to avoid.
And these relate directly to the MAs setting the quantity of photons. Quantum model is when the image appears noisy, blotchy, or grainy.
Like static on an old TV screen.
That's a great analogy. This is a statistical issue. It's caused by too few photons reaching the detector to create a statistically smooth image. It means the technologists use too low of an MAs.
So a model is basically underexposure, but in the digital world.
Yes, and while it leads to poor diagnostic quality, one silver lining is that the patient received a very low radiation dose. The solution is simply to increase the MAs.
And the opposite problem.
The opposite problem, and often more serious in terms of patient safety and data loss, is saturation.
Saturation implies the detector is just overwhelmed.
It is. Saturation occurs when the image receptor receives too many photons, a massive overexposure. The detector elements are physically overwhelmed, and they can no longer accurately record differences in signal intensity.
So the image is just blown out.
Blown out is a good way to put it. It will appear extremely dark or bright, but the critical problem is that detail in the densest, brightest areas, the radiopaque structures, is often irreversibly lost.
So if quantum model means you need more photons, saturation means you have way too many and you've just wasted dose.
Precisely. Saturation is a major issue because, unlike model, where you can easily repeat the image with a higher dose, once true saturation occurs, the data is gone. It means the patient received an unnecessarily and sometimes dangerously high dose for a completely non-diagnostic result.
You're always aiming for that Goldilocks zone.
Exactly. That Goldilocks zone in MAs to ensure statistical accuracy without overwhelming the detector.
Even in that zone, though, soft tissues often lack intrinsic contrast because they're chemically very similar. They're isodents. This leads us to why we use contrast media.
Right. The human body is mostly water and low atomic number elements, which don't create much differential attenuation. Trying to visualize blood vessels or the lining of the stomach against muscle is often impossible.
They just blend together.
They do. So contrast media, which are typically compounds containing high atomic number elements like iodine or barium, are introduced into the body.
You inject them or have the patient drink them.
Right. And their purpose is to artificially increase the radiopacity of those soft tissues or vessels.
How does that work in terms of the photoelectric effect we discussed earlier?
Well, by introducing high-Z elements like iodine or barium, we dramatically increase the likelihood of photoelectric absorption occurring in that specific area.
Ah, so you make it act like bone, essentially.
That's a perfect way to think about it. This creates a huge artificial density difference against the surrounding isodens tissues, making the previously invisible structure suddenly stand out bright white on the image. It allows for critical visualization of pathology or anatomy.
So it's an essential tool.
An essential tool, but it does introduce its own risks, including patient reactions and renal stress, hashtag 2.3, the mathematics of exposure maintenance.
We've established that the three controls, KVP, MAs, and SID, are constantly affecting image quality and dose. Therefore, the ability to adjust those factors while maintaining adequate image receptor exposure is absolutely essential.
It is.
We're now talking about the exposure maintenance problems that technologists have to solve instantly.
This is where the physics turns into practical arithmetic on the fly. The challenge is if I must change one factor for clinical reasons, say I need higher KVP for better penetration through a very large patient, I have to know exactly how to compensate with the other factor, MAs, to keep the final image from being too dark or too light.
And the primary tool for this compensation is the 15% rule. This rule is so critical we need to walk through the logic and the practical application.
The 15% rule is the most fundamental adjustment tool. It's based on the understanding that KVP is incredibly powerful. The relationship is exponential. A small change in energy, KVP, creates a massive change in beam intensity reaching the detector.
So what's the rule?
The rule states, A 15% increase in kVp will approximately double the overall intensity of the beam reaching the image receptor.
Wait, hold on. If a 15% kVp increase doubles the intensity and we just have the MAs to compensate, why do we bother changing kVp at all if the dose and image quality just stay the same?
That's an excellent challenging question, and it hits the absolute core of dose reduction.
Okay.
We change the kVp because while the total exposure to the receptor remains the same, the characteristics of the beam are fundamentally different. By increasing kVp, we produce a harder beam, a beam with a higher average energy.
Right, more penetrating.
More penetrating, meaning it is less likely to be absorbed by the patient-less photoelectric effect and more likely to pass through to the detector.
So using the highest kVp possible within acceptable contrast limits is key to safety.
Absolutely. By using a 15% kVp increase and having the MAs, we maintain image darkness, but we significantly reduce the total number of photons produced, which reduces patient dose while improving penetration efficiency.
And the other way around.
Conversely, if you need to decrease penetration, a 15% decrease in kVp halves the beam intensity, so you must double the MAs to maintain exposure. This rule is constantly applied in practice to manage dose.
Now let's talk about distance, the third factor, and the physics that governs it. The terrifyingly powerful inverse square law problems.
The inverse square law is the most powerful physical principle we use in both dose calculation and safety. It states that the intensity of the X-ray beam is inversely proportional to the square of the distance from the source.
Okay, so it applies to all point source electromagnetic radiation.
But in radiography, the implications are just massive.
Unpack that squared relationship for me. If I am using a portable X-ray unit and I accidentally move the tube half the recommended distance closer to the patient, what happens?
Okay, so if you have the distance, say, moving from 40 inches to 20 inches, the exposure intensity at the receptor, or more importantly, the patient's skin, does not just double.
It's squared.
It increases by the square of 2, which is 4. You have quadrupled the intensity.
No.
Conversely, and thankfully, if a technologist takes a step back, doubling their distance from the scattered radiation source, the dose they receive instantly drops to 25% of the original level.
This means that distance isn't a subtle adjustment, it's an operational earthquake.
It is the single most critical factor.
Yeah.
Technologists use a specific formula to calculate the necessary MAs correction when the SID must be changed. New MAs equals original MAs times new SID divided by old SID.
A mouthful, but essential.
Any changes in distance necessitate an exponential change in MAs to maintain the image. But this law is the bedrock of personnel radiation protection distance equals dose reduction, guaranteed.
We're transitioning now from the cold mathematics of physics to the biological reality of interaction. This is where all that knowledge about kVp, MAs, and the inverse square law becomes a matter of lifelong health.
Absolutely.
We're moving into section 3, safety, biology, and dose management. Hashtag tag 3.1, biological impact and acute exposure. Okay, not all tissues react equally to radiation. Let's start by introducing some technical language that dictates damage. We need to introduce and explain concepts like linear energy transfer, LET, and relative biological effectiveness, RBE. These are crucial components of radiobiology.
Right, we need these terms to quantify damage. Linear energy transfer, LET, describes how quickly energy is transferred to the biological material as radiation passes through.
Okay.
X-rays are considered low-lit radiation because they travel far and deposit energy sparsely. High-lit radiation, like alpha particles, deposits a huge amount of energy over a very short distance, causing massive localized damage.
And RBE connects that transfer to the actual biological damage.
Correct. Relative biological effectiveness, RBE, is a measure used to compare the effectiveness of different types of radiation in causing biological damage. Since high-lit radiation causes denser ionization and more damage, it has a much higher RBE than low-lit X-rays, even for the same absorbed dose.
So it helps us understand why certain types of radiation exposure are far more dangerous than others.
Precisely.
Based on this, let's circle back to the patient. Explain the concept of radiosensitivity. Which cells and tissues are most vulnerable to X-ray damage?
The fundamental principle, established decades ago, is that cells that are rapidly dividing, immature, and non-specialized are the most radiosensitive.
This is the law of Bergoni and Trebondo, right?
That's the one. Tissues like the rapidly proliferating bone marrow, which produces blood cells, the reproductive cells in the gonads, and the crystalline lens of the eye are critically sensitive.
And on the other end of the spectrum.
Conversely, slowly dividing, highly specialized cells like muscle tissue and nerve cells are generally considered radioresistant.
Now, the consequences of exposure can also be divided based on the timeline and who experiences the damage. We need to differentiate between somatic effects and genetic effects.
Right. Somatic effects are the damages expressed within the lifetime of the exposed individual.
Things like cancer.
Things like cancer induction, which is a stochastic or probabilistic effect, and deterministic effects, which have a threshold dose, like acute radiation syndrome or cataracts.
And genetic effects.
Genetic effects, on the other hand, are damages that occur to the DNA of the reproductive cells, but are expressed in future generations of the exposed individual. We protect rigorously against both, but those stochastic effects like cancer induction are the primary focus of long-term safety planning.
Let's discuss what happens during an immediate high-level exposure, which we call acute radiation exposure, the acute radiation syndrome. The body responds in 4 named stages, and the timeline and dose level are crucial.
This syndrome only occurs following extremely high doses delivered over a short period, typically above 1 gray or Gi. The first stage, occurring hours to a day after exposure, is the prodromal stage.
And the symptom.
It's characterized by initial transient symptoms like nausea, vomiting, fatigue, and diarrhea, related primarily to gastrointestinal distress.
Then we enter the period of deceptive calm.
That's the second stage, the latent manifest stage. This is a period lasting from hours to weeks where the patient appears to be clinically recovered. The symptoms vanish and a false sense of security can set in.
But internally?
Internally, the biological damage, particularly the destruction of stem cells in the bone marrow, is progressing rapidly and often irreversibly.
And what dictates the final phase?
The dose received dictates which organ system fails first, defining the final stage. The hematopoietic syndrome at 1 to 10 gray involves the failure of the blood-forming system.
And higher doses.
The gastrointestinal syndrome from 10 to 50 gray involves the destruction of the GI tract lining, leading to infection and fluid loss. And finally, the central nervous system, CNS syndrome, at 50 gray or more, involves total neurological collapse and death within hours or days.
And the final stage?
The final stage is either the recovery stage or, tragically, progression to death, depending on whether the body's repair mechanisms can outpace the cellular damage. #TAC 3.2 dose limits and practical protection.
To prevent these catastrophic effects and minimize the stochastic long-term risks, regulations mandate strict effective dose limits for different populations. We need to state and explain the regulatory necessity for these limits in detail.
These limits are regulatory constraints based on the foundational safety principle, LARA.
As low as reasonably achievable.
Exactly. The limits are set so low that the risk of fatal cancer induction remains minimal over a lifetime. They're expressed in sieverts, SV, or millisieverts, MSV.
So let's talk numbers. What's the limit for people who work with this stuff?
For occupational exposures, meaning medical personnel who receive a benefit for their work, the current whole-body effective dose limit is 50 millivg, or 5 rem per year. This limit acknowledges they are actively working with the source, but it is strictly monitored and enforced.
How does that compare to the average person, the general public?
For public exposures, individuals who are not patients or occupational workers and receive no benefit from the radiation, the annual effective dose limit is drastically lower.
How much lower?
Typically 1 millivg per year. This reflects the philosophy that the general public should be protected from any unwarranted exposure.
And the most stringent limit of all applies to the fetus.
It does. The developing fetus is highly vulnerable. For declared pregnant occupational personnel, the dose limit to the fetus is only 5 millisv for the entire gestation period.
For the whole 9 months?
Yes, and it's often further refined to 0.5 millisv per month. This requires meticulous monitoring and is why pregnant technologists must declare their status immediately so they can be provided with a separate lower limit fetal monitoring badge and assigned lower exposure duties.
So what does all this regulation mean for safety in the imaging room? We need to know the primary source of patient exposure and the best methods to reduce it.
The overwhelming majority of the dose received by the patient is the entrance skin dose, ESD, the dose absorbed by the skin surface where the beam enters the body. The goal is to maximize the penetration through the body while minimizing the dose absorbed at that entry point.
Okay, so our sources detail 2 crucial technique adjustments for dose reduction, which tie back directly to our physics discussion. Let's state the first one, the power of technique selection.
The golden technical rule for dose reduction is this. Higher KVP and low LMAs is important to reduce exposure.
Using the 15% rule.
Exactly. We use the 15% rule to achieve this. By increasing the kVp, we harden the beam, making the photons more efficient at passing through the patient. Since fewer interactions occur within the patientless photoelectric absorption, we need fewer total photons, a lower MAs, to achieve the same image quality.
And that achieves the LARA principle.
It does.
What are the other technical tools we use to protect the patient?
We use collimation, restricting the X-ray field size to only the area of interest. Any tissue outside the necessary field is just receiving dose for no diagnostic purpose.
Just irradiating for no reason.
Right. And second, we use filtration. We place thin sheets of aluminum in the path of the primary beam to preferentially absorb the low-energy, non-diagnostic photons.
And why do we want to get rid of those?
Because these low-energy photons would only be absorbed superficially by the patient's skin, contributing only to skin dose and not to image formation. We filter them out, thereby reducing that entrance skin dose.
And the second, non-negotiable golden rule of protection, which applies to everyone.
Distance is the most important factor to reduce exposure. Due to the inverse square law, if personnel are able to double their distance from the scattering source, the patient, they reduce their dose rate by 75%.
75% just by taking a step back.
It's free, it's simple, and it's overwhelmingly effective. This is why specialized staff often stand behind primary barriers like leaded walls or secondary barriers like lead aprons, and why in fluoroscopy, the tube is always positioned under the patient when possible to direct scatter downwards. Hashtag 3.3 monitoring tools, dosimeters.
Since radiation is invisible, we have to measure the accumulated dose received by staff using personnel monitoring devices or dosimeters. We need to discuss the function and basic characteristics of the three primary types.
Right. Personnel monitoring devices are mandatory for anyone who is likely to receive 10% or more of the annual occupational dose limit. The current common standard is the OSL, or optically stimulated luminescence dosimeter.
OSL, what's in it?
The OSL contains a thin layer of aluminum oxide. This material is extremely sensitive, and when it's exposed to radiation, it stores the energy by trapping electrons.
And how do you read the dose from that?
To determine the dose, the material is stimulated by a laser light in a laboratory reader. The stimulation causes the trapped electrons to release their stored energy as light luminescence, which is proportional to the dose received.
And these are the best ones we have now.
They're highly accurate, highly sensitive, and they can be read multiple times. They have largely replaced the older technologies.
And before OSLs became dominant, we often relied on TLDs.
The TLD, or thermoluminescent dosimeter, works on a similar principle, but it's heat-based. It uses materials like lithium fluoride.
And you heat it up to read it.
When the TLD is heated in a specialized reader, it releases the stored radiation energy as light thermoluminescence, which is measured. TLDs are very accurate and durable, but a key limitation is that the act of heating to read the dose essentially erases the stored information.
So you can only read it once.
Only once, unlike OSLs.
And finally, the specialized device for immediate, on-the-spot measurement, the pocket dosimeter.
The pocket dosimeter is unique because it provides instant on-site measurement capability. It's a small, pin-like device that works like a charged capacitor. As it's exposed to radiation, the stored electrical charge leaks out.
And you can see the reading right there.
The user can read the accumulated dose immediately by viewing a small scale through the device. They aren't used for official record keeping, the OSL is the legal record, but they are crucial in high-risk procedures or accident scenarios where an immediate dose estimate is needed before laboratory processing can occur. Hashtag outro.
Well, we successfully navigated the RAD110 study guide, translating foundational physics into practical life-saving knowledge. To synthesize, we focused on three major interconnected themes.
We did.
The physics of production Bremsstrahlung, KVP MBAs, the heat unit problem, the technology of capture, the speed of DR, the mechanisms of the TFT array, and mitigating quantum model, and, of course, the critical rules of safety.
The power of distance, collimation, and the essential 15% kVPMAs adjustment.
And that connection between technical control and biological consequence is the central takeaway, isn't it?
It is. These mathematical rules, the inverse square law and the 15% rule, they are not academic. They are the bedrock of minimizing risk while maximizing diagnostic information. Every single operational choice, whether it's moving the tube a foot closer or opting for a higher KVP, directly impacts the patient's dose and biological risk.
Exactly. Understanding why higher KVP and lower MAs is the dose-reducing choice, because it reduces the quantity of biologically harmful interactions within the patient. That's what turns someone from an operator into an expert safety practitioner.
It truly is about understanding the efficiency trade-offs.
So we'll leave you with a final provocative thought built on this delicate balance. If the golden rule for reducing patient dose is to prioritize higher KVP and lower MAs, we know that high KGP causes Compton scattering to become the dominant interaction over the photoelectric effect, especially in soft tissue. And if Compton scattering reduces image contrast by creating fog, what are the maximum practical KVP limits we must accept in imaging, even if it increases patient dose slightly, to ensure that the necessary diagnostic contrast is maintained and the image isn't rendered useless by Compton fog?
A great question.
Something for you to mull or explore on your own as you consider the complex compromises inherent in applied radiation physics.
Always more to learn and always a trade-off to consider. Thanks for diving in with us.
We'll see you on the next deep dive.